Exclusive videos, story continuations, and bonus content are already available on Patreon before YouTube, so check the link in the description for early access to all new recaps and continuations. Last thing he remembered was honey. Thick amber honey in glass jar on the counter at market. Saturday morning. The sun. The smell of baked goods and lavender. He stretched for a jar and knocked its elbow. She fell onto the asphalt and crashed. Honey spilled over the warm concrete like pool. And through 5 seconds, the bees. Not two. A whole swarm. They were towards sweets. He waved it off. The first bite was on the neck. The second was the wrist. The third in lower lip. He knew that he had an allergy. He knew since childhood. EpiPen was in the car. The car was in parking lot across 2 blocks away. His throat began to tighten. His became shallow and wheezing. His legs bent. He fell to his right in a different of honey. All people. Someone dialed 911. Someone tried shoo the bees. But his body had decided to die. Anaphylactic shock set in quickly. My heart was pounding, then stopped. The last thought was silly. He thought that and didn't, that damn honey. Then darkness. Total and absolute. Not tunnel, no light, no angels of angels, just nothing. And then pain. Completely different kind. Not burning from bites. No choking. Dull, aching pain through body. As if every muscle had been like a rag and pulled back over the bones. And cold. A wet, piercing cold. He opened his eyes. The sky was gray. Not city gray, but lively gray. Heavy clouds drifted so low that it seemed possible reach by hand. Beneath it was something hard and wet. A tree. Wet boards. They were moving, rising and sank rhythmically. Waves. He was lying on the bottom of the boat. No, not a boat. He turned his head. A ship. A long wooden ship with a high prow. A carved beast's head with a snarling mouth jutted out from the prow. Rows of oars stretched out on either side. The oars moved in unison. He tried to raise his hand and realized he couldn't. His wrists were bound with rough rope. Something was pressing against his neck. He touched it with his chin. Iron. An iron collar. Rusty and cold. He tried to sit up. Other people were sitting nearby. Just as dirty. Just as bound. Just as collared. Thralls. The word came to him on its own. He knew that word. He'd read about it in books. Thralls. Slaves. The very bottom of Scandinavian society. Below livestock. Below dogs. He looked at his hands. They weren't his hands. Thin. Dirty. With cracked skin and black nails. His knuckles jutted out like stones beneath the fabric. He was thin. Incredibly thin. His ribs were visible through the thin, tattered shirt. The body was young. Maybe 20 years old. Maybe younger. But it had been ravaged by hunger and labor. Someone kicked him in the thigh. He looked up. Standing over him was a huge, bearded man with a weather-beaten face. His red beard was braided into 2 plaits. An axe hung from his belt. The man was growling something in a language that sounded like rolling stones. The hero didn't understand a word, but his body understood. His body jerked on its own. His hands reached for the oar. The muscle memory of this body's former owner was still working. He gripped the oar and began to row. Pain shot through his back and shoulders. His muscles were weak and exhausted. But he rowed, because the red-bearded man was standing over him, watching, and there was nothing in that gaze but boredom. The kind of boredom with which one looks at an object. Not at a person, at an object. He rowed and tried to think. But thinking was difficult. The body wanted to eat. The body wanted to drink. The body wanted to lie down and not move. And the brain tried to piece together the picture. a drakkar, Vikings, the open sea, an iron collar. He had traveled back in time, or he had died and ended up in hell, or this was the delirium of a dying brain, and in a second it would all be over. But the pain was real, and the cold was real, and the ore was real, and the smell too. Sweat, fish, sea salt, wood, urine. It all hit his nose with such force that his eyes watered. This wasn't delirium. Delirium doesn't smell like this. He kept rowing. There were other thralls around him, 5 or 6. They all rowed in silence. Their eyes were all the same, empty, like those of people who had long since ceased to be human. He realized that the former owner of this body had been one of them, had been empty, had been dead inside long before the new occupant's brain kicked in. Maybe that's why he was here. Maybe the body had been freed, and someone or something had planted another consciousness inside it. His consciousness. A 34-year-old man with a college education. A man who knew that the earth was round. Who knew about germs and antibiotics. Who knew that Greenland lay to the west and Constantinople to the south. Who knew how the Viking age would end. All this knowledge lay in his head like a library in a skeleton's brain. A useless library. Because right now he was a slave on a ship, and his knowledge was worth nothing. Not a single book in the world made him stronger. No formula loosened the iron around his neck. He rowed. The hours passed, or what he considered hours. The sun was nowhere to be seen. Only a gray sky and a gray sea. The waves lifted the ship and lowered it. Again and again. He felt sick. In his past life, he'd get seasick even on a bus. And here was the open sea and a wooden shell without a keel. He held back the vomit. Not because he could, but because there was nothing to throw up. His stomach was empty. Completely. By evening, or what seemed like evening, someone tossed a piece of stale bread to the deckhands. 1 piece for 6 of them. The hero watched as the others tore the bread with their dirty fingers. He got a piece the size of 2 fingers. He shoved it into his mouth. The bread was bitter and hard as a rock. He chewed slowly, squeezing every last bit out of every crumb. His body thanked him. His body was accustomed to crumbs. At night, the trolls weren't untied. They slept on the planks, tied to the benches. The wind picked up. Spray flew over the side and hit their faces. He lay there, shivering. His teeth chattered so loudly it seemed the whole ship could hear. But no one heard. No one cared. He lay there and looked up at the sky. The clouds parted for a moment. He saw the stars. And in that moment, his mind did what no one else on this ship could do. He found the North Star. Then he found Cassiopeia. Then he calculated the bearing. They were heading southwest. If this was the North Sea, then they were heading toward the coast, toward England, or toward Francia. A raid. They were heading out on a raid. He realized this and closed his eyes. In a few days, this ship would dock at a foreign shore. The Vikings would go ashore with axes and swords. They would burn and plunder, and the thralls would haul the loot. And if any of the thralls moved too slowly, they would be hacked to death and left lying there. He knew this. He had read about it. Now he would live through it. His second chance at life began with a collar and an oar, and the only weapon he had was the head on his shoulders. A head that knew too much for a slave, and too little for a free man. Morning came without dawn. The sky simply became a little brighter. From black turned to dark gray. The wind did die down. The waves grew higher. The ship dived with its bow into water and came up with a strained creak. The hero did sleep all night. His ached in places where which he had, muscles between the ribs, muscles along the spine. Even my fingers hurt, every joint of every finger. But my head was working. He spent the night watching, counting, memorizing. On the ship there are about 30 warriors, maybe 35. Exactly count was difficult, because that in the fact they blended into a mass, into fur and iron. Trello 6, including him. 2 were very young. The boys 15, with slender necks and huge eyes. One of them was all night, a wet, hoarse cough. The hero listened to this cough and thought about pneumonia, about that in this world pneumonia is a sentence, without antibiotics, without heat, in the wind, in the sea. This boy was already dead. He was not, didn't about it. The fourth trell was a large man in 40, or 30. Age here was impossible to determine. Life aged quickly. He was bigger the others, but moved slowly. On his back, the hero noticed long, white scars, traces whip, many marks. This man was a slave long ago. The fifth trell was a woman, thin and sinewy, with short, cropped hair. She didn't lift her eyes, never. The sixth sat next with the hero, an old man, or something it looked like an old man, toothless, with sunken cheeks. He rode on autopilot. His arms moved of their own accord. His eyes stared into space. In the morning, the red-bearded man walked along a row of trellises. He kicked each one. Not hard, just checking, like kicking a wagon wheel to see if it's flat. When he reached the coughing boy, he stopped. He looked at him. Then he looked toward the ship's side. The hero understood that look. The red-bearded man was weighing whether to throw the sick boy overboard now or wait. He decided to wait. The boy could still row, for now. They were given water. A leather wineskin was passed around. Everyone took 2 sips. The hero waited for his turn. The water was musty, with a taste of leather and something sour. He took 2 sips and passed it on. His body begged for more. He forbade his body. 2 sips, no more. Discipline. He began to memorize the words. That was the main thing. Without language, he was deaf and mute. And a deaf-mute slave is a dead slave. He listened as the Vikings spoke among themselves. Their speech was rough and guttural, but there was structure to it. He picked out the recurring words. When the red-bearded man pointed to the oar, he uttered 1 word. When he pointed to the water, another. When he shouted at the thralls, a third. The hero memorized them. He repeated them to himself. He linked each word to an action, to an object, to a direction. On the first day, he learned 12 words. Oar, water, food, go, stop, faster, ship, shore, wind, rope, knife, and a word that meant something like nobody. They said it every time they addressed the thralls. By noon, the wind had shifted. The ship rocked differently. The waves crashed not against the bow, but against the side. The sails flapped. The Vikings ran about the deck. Someone was shouting orders. The hero watched everything. He saw a man at the stern holding the rudder oar. The helmsman. The most important person on the ship after the Jarl. The helmsman was not young. Lean, with a weather-beaten face and calm eyes. He didn't shout. He didn't fuss. He simply looked out at the sea and moved the rudder to the left or right with the palm of his hand. And the ship obeyed. The hero looked at the helmsman and thought. This man steered the ship by the sun and the stars, by the direction of the waves, by the color of the water, by the behavior of the birds. He was a navigator, the best on the ship, and the hero knew he could do better. Not because he was smarter than this man, but because he had a map in his head. The entire North Atlantic, the coast of England, the coast of Francia, Norway, Denmark, Iceland. He knew where the currents were, where the shoals were, where the dangerous rocks were. He knew that the Gulf Stream carried warm water from the south, and that if you followed it westward, you could reach Iceland faster. He knew all of this, but he kept silent, because slaves don't know such things. Slaves row, in silence. If a slave suddenly starts talking about currents and navigation, no one will listen to him. They'd kill him. Because a slave who knows more than his master isn't a useful slave. He's a dangerous slave. He rode and kept quiet, and listened, and memorized. By evening, the coughing boy began to row more slowly. His oar fell out of rhythm. The red-bearded man noticed. He walked over. He struck the boy on the back of the head with an open palm. The boy's head jerked forward. He coughed harder. Pink foam appeared on his lips. The hero saw this and understood. Not pneumonia, tuberculosis, the active form. The boy was coughing up blood on everyone around him. In the confined space of the ship, the hero stopped breathing. Then he forced himself to breathe through his nose, slowly, turning his face away from the boy. He knew that tuberculosis is transmitted through airborne droplets. He knew that one sick person could infect 10 others. He knew that the incubation period ranges from 2 weeks to several months. And he knew that in this world, there is no escape from tuberculosis. He needed to move away. He needed to create some distance. But he was tied to the bench. The rope gave him half a meter of freedom, no more. He did the only thing he could. He turned so that the wind blew in his face, so that the air from the boy would be carried in the other direction. A small movement, imperceptible. No one noticed. But that movement was the first conscious decision in his new life, the first application of knowledge. Not navigation, not tactics, not engineering. Simple epidemiology. Turn your face to the wind so as not to breathe in someone else's death. At night, he looked at the stars again. They had shifted. The ship had turned south. He estimated their speed. The Drakkar was traveling about 6 knots, maybe 7 with a good wind. If they had left Norway 3 or 4 days ago, they were now somewhere in the North Sea. It was about a day's journey to the coast of England, maybe 2. He thought about what would happen when they docked. A raid meant chaos. Chaos meant opportunity. In chaos, you could steal a knife. In chaos, you could hide a piece of bread. In chaos, you could do something that would make one of the Vikings look at you differently. Not like an object, like a person with a brain. But he couldn't rush it. One wrong move and his head would end up on the deck, separated from his body. He closed his eyes. His body was shivering from the cold. His stomach was cramping from hunger. A coughing boy was wheezing nearby. The old man was muttering something in his sleep. And he lay there, making a plan. His first plan, a primitive one. Survive until they reach shore. Become useful. Don't die. 3 points. As simple as a rock, and just as difficult. On the 3rd morning, he saw birds. Seagulls. 3 of them circled above the ship, screaming and diving toward the water. Last my life, the seagulls were just noisy birds on beach. Here, they meant the land. The shore was near. The Vikings, too, knew. The mood on the ship changed. They checked their weapons. They sharpened there on wet stones. They pulled leather helmets. They laughed and pushed each other. They were getting ready for work. Their work was to kill and plunder. The hero rode and watched. He saw the Jarl. For the first time, took a closer look in him properly. They stood at the bow of the ship, next to it with carved head of a beast. It was tall. Taller at everyone on the ship at by half a head. Broad shoulders. Long, light hair tied in a ponytail. Beard neatly trimmed. On it was chainmail. Real chainmail made small rings. This meant that he was rich. The chainmail cost as a herd cows. On his belt hung a sword. There and only as the others. A sword. One's status of status. The Jarl looked at the horizon and remained silent. He didn't fuss. He shouted. He waited. Beside would they stood a man whose the hero noticed earlier in the first day. Short, thin, with a sly face and quick eyes. He did carry weapons. Instead, he was a bundle sticks around his neck. Runes. This was priest. Or something sort of a priest. Advisor. A person who spoke to the Jarl. That the gods. The hero remembered him. The priest might be useful. Or dangerous. And both. By noon, on the horizon, a line of the shore. The Vikings roared. That was not a scream. This was a roar. 30 sips at once, the sound of which made the air. The hero felt that the hairs on his stand on end. No, out with delight. Out fear. This sound meant death. Not his death. The death of Ide of the shore. People who still didn't knew that Tabar was a ship with carved head at bow. The ship was toward the shore quickly. The wind was favorable. The sails filled out. The oars worked in a frenzied rhythm. The red-bearded man pounded his fist against the side of the boat, setting the pace. Faster. Even faster. The hero rowed at his limit. His muscles burned. His back cracked. But he rowed. Because to stop meant to die. The shore was approaching. He saw green hills, a gray strip of beach, little houses with thatched roofs, smoke from the chimneys. A village, a small fishing village, maybe 50 people, maybe 100. They didn't stand a chance. The Drakkar struck the sand with its keel. The ship shuddered. The Vikings leaped over the side into the shallow water, splashing foam, shouting, axes in hand. They ran toward the village. The hero saw the first warrior reach the nearest house. The door burst open from the impact of a kick. A scream came from inside, a woman's, high-pitched and short. Then silence. He sat on the bench, tied to an oar. He couldn't run, couldn't help, couldn't do anything. He just watched and listened. Screams, the clang of metal, the crack of wood, the lowing of cattle, weeping. It all blended into a single sound, the sound of a raid. He knew that sound from textbooks, from documentaries, from museum exhibits. He had heard a reenactment of that sound through headphones while standing in front of a display case with a Viking helmet. Now he was hearing the real thing. The real thing was worse, much worse. Because you can pause a documentary. The red-bearded man returned after a while. He untied the thralls from the benches, but he didn't remove the ropes from their hands. He simply lengthened the tethers. Now they could walk, 10 paces from the ship. Redbeard pointed to the shore and uttered a long phrase. The hero didn't understand the words, but he understood the gesture. Carry. The Vikings were hauling their loot out of the village. Sacks of grain, bundles of hides, barrels, iron tools. The thralls were supposed to haul all of this onto the ship. The hero stood up. His legs buckled. He grabbed the ship's side. He stood there for a moment. Then he jumped into the water. It was freezing. It came up to his knees. His legs went numb immediately. He waded toward the shore. The first sack was heavy. Grain, maybe barley, maybe rye. He hoisted the sack onto his shoulder and carried it to the ship. His body protested. Every step was torture. But he carried on. Because a thrall who doesn't carry is useless. And a useless troll becomes a dead troll. He made 4 trips. On the 5th, he fell. His knees just buckled. The sack collapsed beside him. He lay on the wet sand, gasping for air. The red-bearded man looked at him, then at the sack, then at him again. He said something contemptuous, but he didn't strike him, so he was being patient, for now. The hero got up. He picked up the sack. He carried it. And at that moment, he saw something. Among the loot unloaded onto the shore lay plants, bundles of herbs, dried and fresh. Someone in the village had been gathering medicinal herbs, or trading them. The Vikings had carried them out along with everything else, not because they knew their value, but because they took everything. The hero looked at the herbs. He recognized some of them. Yarrow, plantain, something else that looked like chamomile. In his time, these were his grandmother's remedies for colds. In this time, they were medicine, the only medicine. He memorized where the herbs were. Then he went back to hauling sacks. On his 7th trip, he walked past and discreetly reached down. He plucked a bunch of yarrow, tucked it into his shirt. A small movement, quick. No one noticed. Yarrow, a hemostatic, antiseptic. If you crush fresh leaves and apply them to a wound, the bleeding slows down. If you make a decoction and wash the wound, the risk of infection drops. He knew this. He'd read about it. Never used it, but he knew. The knowledge lay in his pocket, or rather, tucked under his shirt. Small and insignificant. A bunch of herbs. But it was the first thing in this world he had obtained on his own. It wasn't given to him. It wasn't tossed to him like a piece of bread to a dog. He took it, by himself. The raid ended by evening. The Vikings returned to the ship with their spoils. Among the spoils were 2 new captives, a man and a woman, bound, their eyes wide with terror. Future thralls. The hero looked at them and saw himself, from yesterday. They didn't understand yet. In a week they would understand. In a month they would stop crying. In a year they would become like the old man with empty eyes, if they survived. The Jarl inspected the spoils. He walked along the items laid out on the deck and counted. The priest walked beside him, muttering something. He was counting the god's share. 1/10. The hero knew this. A tithe went to the sacrifice. The rest was divided among the warriors. The thralls were entitled to nothing. They were part of the spoils, not those who divided them. At night, the ship pulled away from the shore. The village was burning. Orange reflections of the flames lay on the black water. Smoke rose into the sky, mingling with the clouds. Beautiful, if you didn't think about the fact that someone's homes were burning. The hero lay on the planks and thought about the yarrow in his bosom. About the fact that in this world he was nothing. A zero. Meat on bones tied to an oar. But a zero has one quality. No one expects anything from it. No one watches a zero. No one fears a zero. And that means a zero can do things that others don't notice. Pick herbs. Listen to words. Count stars. To save up. Bit by bit. Little by little. Until he has enough to stop being zero. He closed his eyes. The coughing boy wheezed more quietly. He was growing weaker. Soon he would be gone. And no one would think about that either, because a troll isn't a person. A troll is an oar with a pulse. On 4th day at sea, the boy died. This happened at dawn. The hero woke up from the silence, not from sound, but from its absence. A cough which the boy every night suddenly stopped. The hero turned his head. The boy was lying on his side, curled up. His noth were open. His mouth, too. The skin turned gray, with shade of gray that doesn't in the living. The hero looked at him. He didn't feel anything, or thought that didn't felt. Then I realized that I his eyes. Know from the wind. It didn't know this boy. He didn't his name. I didn't where they took him. He told him a word, but he was right. 3 nights. He heard his cough. I felt his of body through the boards, and now the body was cold. The red-bearded man approached. He looked at the dead man. He uttered a short word. Then he untied the rope from the bench. He took off the collar. The iron will come in handy for another trellis. Then he grabbed the body under his and dragged it to the side. He lifted it. He tipped it over. Splash. The ship sailed on. Even the rhythm of the oars didn't stutter. The hero looked overboard. Body the boys swayed on waves, getting smaller. Then it vanished. The second troll boy sat on his bench and looked in the same direction. His lips trembled. but he was silent. They were all silent. The troll's silence was not quiet. It was empty, like the silence of furniture. The hero returned to his oar. He rowed. He thought. The boy's death meant something practical. One less rower. The load on the others had increased. He had to row for 1.5 people. His body was already working at its limit. Now the limit had shifted. He knew he wouldn't last long. His muscles weren't recovering. They gave him little food, even less water. There weren't enough calories even for his basal metabolic rate. His body was consuming itself. His muscles were wasting away. Soon everything else would start to waste away too. He needed more food, or less work, or both. But a troll doesn't choose. A troll takes what he's given, if he's given anything. By noon, he started counting. It helped him not think about his hunger. He counted everything in sight: the planks on the deck, the rings in the Jarl's chainmail, the number of strokes per minute, the wind speed by the ripples on the water, the distance to the horizon. He knew the formula: the square root of the height of his eyes multiplied by a coefficient. His eyes were about 2 meters above the water, so the horizon was about 4 kilometers away. Useless knowledge, but it kept his mind occupied. The brain that wasn't occupied with work began to think about food, about water, about pain, about hopelessness. It was better to count. Toward evening, something happened. The ship was passing a rocky outcrop. The helmsman was steering the vessel 100 meters from the shore. It was close, dangerously close. The hero could see rocks beneath the water, dark, jagged patches beneath the greenish surface, underwater rocks, cliffs. If the ship's hull scraped against them, it would be the end. The wood would split. Water would pour in. A drakkar isn't the kind of ship that survives a breach. The helmsman steered with confidence. He knew these waters, apparently. But then the wind picked up sharply. A gust hit the sail. The ship listed, sharply. The port side took on water. The oars on the left side struck a wave. One of them snapped. A crack. A scream. The warrior struck by the splinter clutched his face. Blood flowed between his fingers. The ship continued to list. It was being carried toward the rocks. The helmsman leaned heavily on the rudder oar. The veins bulged in his neck. He pulled the rudder to the right, but the current was stronger. The hero saw the rocks. They were getting closer. 50 meters remained. 30. 20. He rowed with all his might. Everyone was rowing. But one broken oar disrupted the rhythm. The port side was pulling weaker. The ship was spinning around. At that moment, the hero did something that changed everything. He shouted. One word. A word he'd heard from the helmsman when he changed course. A word that meant something like, row to the left, or get out of the way. He bellowed it with all his might. Not to the helmsman, to the rowers on the starboard side, to those sitting closer to him. Because he understood physics. If the starboard side slowed its strokes and the port side sped up, the ship would turn to the right of the rocks, out into open water. He shouldn't have shouted. A thrall doesn't shout. A thrall is silent. But the body acted faster than the mind, or the mind acted faster than fear. A few rowers on the starboard side hesitated for a second, maybe out of surprise, maybe because the word was right. For a single second, the starboard side slowed down. The port side kept rowing, and the ship turned just a little. 2 degrees. 3. That was enough. The helmsman pushed the tiller all the way. The ship passed 10 meters from the rocks, so close that the hero could see the wet seaweed on their surface. Then they were in open water. Everyone was breathing, heavily and rapidly. Redbeard stood in the middle of the deck and watched the rocks recede astern. Then he turned and looked at the trolls. At the troll who had been screaming. At the hero. Their eyes met. Redbeard stared for a long time. 3 seconds. 5. The hero lowered his gaze, just as his body had taught him. Trolls don't look into eyes. But it was too late. Redbeard had seen. Redbeard had heard. The slave knew the word, the right word, at the right moment. It was bad. Or good. The hero didn't know. That evening he sat on his bench and waited for them to come, to strike him, or worse. But no one came. Redbeard didn't return. Maybe he forgot. Maybe he didn't care. Maybe he was thinking. A thinking Viking is an unpredictable Viking. He should have just struck him. A blow is understandable. Silence is not. At night, the hero lay there and cursed himself. He had let his guard down. Too soon. Too stupid. One word. One damned word shouted in panic. And now someone knows that this thrall isn't as empty as the rest, that there's something in this head. He remembered the rule he'd made up on the first night. Dose out knowledge. Give away just enough to be useful. No more. He broke the rule on the 4th day. Idiot. But then he thought differently. The ship didn't crash. He's alive. Everyone's alive. And if Redbeard is thinking, maybe he's not thinking about how to punish the slave, but about why the slave knew that word. And maybe this is the first hook, the first thread, the first microscopic chance to become something other than an oar with a pulse. Or the first step toward death. Both options are equally real. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep. It didn't work. He lay there and listened to the sea, and thought about how, in this world, every word can cost a life, and every silence, too. Retribution came in the morning, but not the one he expected. The red-bearded approached to him it silently. He leaned down, untied the rope from the bench. Know that held it to the oar seat. The hero froze. His began to pound. Untie from the bench meant one of two. Either it is to another job, or they are to the ship. The red-bearded man grabbed him by collar and pulled him. The hero stood up. His legs were stiff. He barely stayed on his feet. The red-bearded man shoved him forward, toward the bow of the ship. There were the Earl. The trolls did go to the Jarl. The trolls do see the Jarl. The trolls do exist in world of the Jarl. But his was called. The Jarl stood at the blow and was eating. A piece of smoked meat. Fat dripped down my fingers. Jarl looked at the troll whom brought the red-bearded man. He looked how they at dead fish washed by the wave, with light curiosity. The red-bearded man said something to the Jarl, a long sentence. The hero caught a few words. Rock. Word. Scream. The red-bearded told about yesterday. The Jarl finished the meat, wiped his meat on my pants, then looked at Hero. His eyes were gray, cold, not angry, just indifferent, like stones. Jarl spoke a single word, a short one. The hero didn't understand. Jarl repeated, slower, and added a gesture. He pointed to his ear, then to the hero's. Speak. The hero stood and thought, quickly, feverishly, what to say, how put it. He knew 20 words, maybe 25, children's vocabulary. Any mistake could be the last. He decided to say, easily, like a child. He pointed to himself, then at the overboard, then onto a rock which had remained behind the stern. He uttered a that meant stone, then the word meaning ship. Then he made a strike. Stone, ship, strike. The Jarl watched. The red-bearded man stood beside with his arms. The priest also approached. His small eyes were shining. The hero continued. He pointed to oars. He gestured with his hands how they row. One side faster, The other is slower. The ship turns. Simple physics. It did use a word that could explain. Only gestures and the simplest nouns. Jarl remained silent, then turned to the helmsman. The helmsman was standing at the helm and looked at this scene. The Jarl asked him something. The helmsman replied briefly. He nodded. So he confirmed. The slave shouted the right word. The slave helped. The Jarl looked at the hero and asked Alek. The hero did understand all words, but the intonation was clear. Where from? Where did know? The dangerous question. The hero was for it all night, and at him had answer. He pointed to his ears, then at the helmsman. I heard him. He spoke. I remembered. A simple lie, a plausible lie. Slaves hear everything. They remain silent, but their ears are working. If a slave sits next to the helmsman for a few weeks and listens to his commands, he can memorize the words. That explained his knowledge of the term. It didn't explain why he shouted it out, but the Jarl didn't dig any deeper. He looked at the hero for another second. Then he said something to the red-bearded man, briefly, like an order. The red-bearded man nodded. He grabbed the hero by the collar and dragged him back, but not to the old bench, to another spot, closer to the stern, closer to the helmsman, closer to the center of the ship, where the warriors sat, not the thralls. The Redbeard tied him to a new bench, gave him a long rope, about 3 meters. Then he tossed him a piece of meat. Not bread, meat, smoked. The same kind the Jarl had been eating, a piece the size of a palm. Redbeard left. The hero sat and stared at the meat in his hands. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, from hunger, and from the realization of what had just happened. He hadn't been killed. He'd been moved, closer to the helmsman, so he could hear more, or so the helmsman could keep an eye on him, or both. And they gave him meat that a thrall wasn't supposed to have. It wasn't a reward. It was an investment. The Jarl was investing in the slave. Calories. Just enough so the slave could think. The Jarl thought like a merchant. The hero ate the meat. Slowly. Every bite. Every fiber. His body screamed with joy. Protein. Fat. Salt. The 3 things he'd been missing most. He sat in his new spot and watched the helmsman. The helmsman stood 5 meters away from him. His name was Bjorn. The hero heard the other warriors addressing him. Bjorn. Bear. A name that fit this wiry, calm man like a glove. Bjorn paid no attention to the hero. To him, the thrall at the new bench was just as much of a blank space as the thrall at the old one. But the hero now heard every word Bjorn spoke, every command, every comment about the wind and the waves and the currents. It was like sitting in a lecture hall. Only instead of a professor, there was a Viking navigator, and instead of notes, there was memory. Over the next 3 days, the hero learned 40 more words, all related to the sea: current, high tide, low tide, shoal, depth, north wind, southerly wind, storm, fog, star, sun. He soaked it all up like a sponge. Bjorn didn't know he was being listened to. He was just doing his job, muttering to himself, giving orders, cursing the wind. And the hero sat 3 meters away, committing everything to his internal library. The priest was watching too. The hero felt his gaze. The priest stood by the mast, twirling his runes between his fingers. And he watched. Not the sea, the hero. It was unpleasant. The red-bearded man was simple. The Jarl was pragmatic. Bjorn was indifferent. But the priest was something else. The priest was searching. The hero didn't know exactly what the priest was looking for, but he sensed that the priest saw more than the others, that the priest felt this thrall was not like the others, not because he was smart, but because he was different, a stranger, from another place, or another time. On the 7th day of the voyage, land came into view. Another shore. Not the one they had plundered. This shore was familiar to the Vikings. They were heading home. The hero saw a rocky coastline, dark cliffs, green slopes, a fjord, a narrow, long bay cutting into the land. The ship entered it. The walls of the fjord rose on both sides, tall and gray. The water grew calm, mirror-like. After a week on the open sea, the fjord's silence seemed unnatural, as if the world had been put on pause. Deep within the fjord lay a settlement. Long wooden houses with thatched roofs, a dock made of rough logs, boats on the shore, smoke from a dozen stoves, people on the shore, women, children, old people. They were waiting. They knew the ship was returning. The Drakkar pulled up to the shore. The Vikings stepped ashore. They were greeted with shouts and embraces. Wives rushed to their husbands. Children clung to their legs. The victors returned with their spoils, a celebration. The hero was untied from the bench. He and the other thralls. They were led ashore, lined up. People from the settlement approached and stared, especially at the two new captives from the English village. They stood there, their faces pale. The woman was crying. The man stared at the ground. The hero stood and looked around. He saw the world he had entered, the Jarl's settlement, 20 or 30 houses, perhaps 100 inhabitants, a smithy, cattle pens, a few boats on the shore, a small world at the edge of the fjord, a small, cruel world. This is where he would have to live. This is where he would have to become someone, or die. The red-bearded man led the thralls to a longhouse on the outskirts, lower and smaller than the rest, with a dirt floor and the smell of manure, a slave house. They were led inside, tied to posts. They threw straw on the floor. These were their beds. The hero lay down on the straw. It was damp and smelled of mold, but it was solid ground, firm, unmoving. After a week on a rocking ship, solid ground felt like a luxury. He lay there and touched the bundle of yarrow in his bosom. It had dried out. The stems had become brittle. But he didn't throw it away. It was his first possession, his first resource, small and pitiful, but his. He closed his eyes. The first phase was over. He had survived at sea. Now the second phase was beginning, to become useful on land, and not to die in the process. The first morning on land began with a kick. The red-bearded entered into slave house once before dawn, kicked every of them in the legs. The hero jumped up. The body protested. Every muscle was stiff after a week on oars. But he got up. Quickly. That's that had mastered the rule. Slow trell is a broken trell. They were led outside. It was cold. Fog lay in fjord like milk in a cup, white and thick. The air smells of grass and smoke. The hero stood barefoot feet on ground and felt the cold rising up his bones. The red-bearded man distributed the work, with gestures and short commands. 2 trolls sent to the pen, for the livestock pen, clean manure. A woman and one of the new prisoners to the longhouse of the Jarl. There were hands to cooking and cleaning. A man with scars on back to the smithy, carrying coal and pumping the bellows. The old man with empty eyes was left in slave house. He no could work. The hero realized that this meant the old man will become the next, after the coughing boy. His won't be overboard. He will simply stop. In a week, he will die on his own, quietly and quietly, like the wick candle. The hero, red-bearded, stared at him, then led to the shore of the fjord. There lay upside-down boats, small ones, not Drakkars. Fishing boats, about 4 or 5 people. Boards on some have warped, gaps gaped. The red-bearded man pointed at the boats, then at barrel of tar standing next to it. Then, through the cracks, apply resin, caulk, repair. The hero nodded. The work was simple, physically hard but simple. Knead the toe, stuff into the cracks, pour with tar. He knew the principle. He in the museum. I read in books on the shipbuilding. Who could have that this knowledge would come in handy? He worked all day. His were tar. Black, viscous mass had clogged under my fingernails. The smell was so that it in throat. But he worked. Carefully. Thoroughly. Not because that I loved boats, but that because the quality work is the language that everyone, even those who don't consider you a human being. By noon, he finished the first boat. He moved on to the second. The red-bearded man came to check. He leaned over. He ran his finger along the seam. I looked at finger. Clean. Tar was evenly. Toe didn't sticking out. The red-bearded nothing said, but he didn't hit him, and didn't frown. For Thrall, the praise. Working, the hero observed the settlement. He saw the structure, the hierarchy. Everything was just in textbook. Jarl upstairs. His house is big. His wife went in silver jewelry. Below, the Earl bonds. Free landowners. A man 10. About each has home and their own. They grew barley and kept livestock. More lower dwarfs. Free but poor. Workers. Farmhands. Fishermen. They lived in close quarters, in 2 or 3 families in one house, and in fact bottomed the trellis, belongings, possessions. Between the dwarf and the slave, there a chasm. Carl could become a bond if he got rich. Thrall could do anything. Only dead a troll, if the master doesn't decide otherwise, unless the owner does release him. This happened rarely, but it did happen. The hero knew this from history. Thrall could have been for exceptional service, or by a will, or in redemption. The redemption was the real way, but for the ransom, money. And Thrall had. Closed circle. He thought about this tarring the second boat. A circle is get be broken. Not by force. The strength had him had. With his mind. He must become so useful that Jarl it more profitable to raise than keep it surface. Economic logic. The only logic that the authorities in any century. In the evening, the trellises was food. A bowl of porridge made barley. No salt, no meat, just overcooked grain and water. The hero ate his portion, then licked the bowl, then my fingers. Every calorie counts. He sat in slave house and listened. Through thin walls came sounds of the voices. Laughter. The road of a hammer from the smithy. The lowing of cows. The barking of a dog. Life. Ordinary life of the Vol or 10th century. It did know exactly what the year. That was important. From that, a lot kid. If this the beginning of the century, then era of raids was beginning. Lindisfarne had plundered in 793. If this was the middle of the year, then the Vikings had established Danelaw in England. If it was the end of the century, then Alfred the Great had already fought them. Each period presented different opportunities and threats. He needed to determine the time, indirectly, by the weapons, by the style of the ships, by the political conversations, if he could understand enough of the words. On the second day, he was sent back to the boats. He finished the second one and started the third. He worked and listened. Nearby on the shore, 2 young warriors were mending a net. They were talking, loudly, not minding the thrall. A thrall is a wall. Walls don't listen. The hero listened. He caught 1 word out of 5, but the context helped. They were talking about a raid, about the spoils, about the next expedition. One of them mentioned a name, Ragnar. The hero froze. Ragnar. It could have been any name, a common Scandinavian name. But what if they were talking about that very Ragnar? Ragnar Lodbrok, the legendary chieftain. That gave him a sense of time. The mid-9th century, around the 850s or 860s. A time of great expansion. a time when the Vikings were still victorious. He kept working. His hands moved on their own while his brain processed the information. If this was the 850s, then in a few years Ragnar's sons would assemble a great pagan army and invade England. It would be a grand campaign. Thousands of warriors, dozens of ships. They would conquer almost all of England except for Wessex. That was the future, and he knew it. On the third day, something happened in the settlement. A foreign ship approached the dock. Not from this fjord. A merchant ship. Wider and shorter than a drakkar, with a deep hold packed with goods. Merchants. They brought cloth and salt and silverware and beads and spices. The settlement came alive. People crowded the shore. They examined the goods. They haggled. The hero watched this from his spot by the boats. He saw the Jarl approach the merchant. How they talked. How the Jarl felt the fabric and weighed the silver in his hand. And he saw something else. The merchant was cheating. The hero saw this because he understood math. The merchant was using scales. Small bronze scales with two pans. Silver was placed on one, weights on the other. But the weights were wrong. One of them was too light. The hero could tell by the way it behaved on the scales. It dropped a little faster. It bounced a little more lightly. The difference was negligible. Maybe 10%. But on every transaction, the merchant cheated the buyer out of a tenth. The hero remembered this. He didn't say anything. He didn't show it. He just remembered. Another pebble in the collection. Another piece of knowledge that might come in handy at the right moment. But the moment had to be right. Not now. Right now he was caulking boats. Right now he was a thing. And things don't notice fraud. The merchant sailed away 2 days later. The Jarl bought salt and cloth. He paid in silver. He overpaid. The hero knew. The Jarl didn't know. Not yet. On the 5th day, on the shore, the hero heard a scream, sharp and painful. He turned. A man was lying by the smithy, a large troll with scars on his back. He clutched his right arm. Blood was flowing from his arm. A lot of blood. The hero could see the wound even from a distance. A long gash from elbow to wrist. A red-hot piece of metal had slipped and sliced through his arm like a knife. The blacksmith stood nearby, cursing. Not out of compassion. He was angry that he'd lost a worker. The red-bearded man approached. He looked at the wound. He said something. Most likely, he ordered it to be bandaged. But how to bandage it? With a rag. A dirty rag. There were no other bandages in this world. The hero looked at the blood, and thought of the yarrow in his bosom, of the bundle of dry stems he had been carrying for 6 days. The moment. The right moment. Or not. He hesitated. To intervene meant drawing attention again, to show again that he knew something a troll shouldn't know. But if he didn't intervene, the big troll might die of blood poisoning. And the big troll was his only strong ally in the slave house. Not a friend, an ally. In this world, a slave has no friends. He made his decision. He stood up. He walked over to the Redbeard. It was a violation. A troll does not approach an overseer without being summoned. The Redbeard looked at him in surprise. The hero pulled yarrow from his bosom. He showed it to him. Then he pointed to the large troll's wound. Then he crushed the dry leaves between his fingers and pressed them against his own hand, demonstrating. The Redbeard watched. He didn't understand, or pretended not to understand. The hero repeated the action. He took a few crushed leaves. He leaned toward the wounded man. The man looked at him with eyes wild with pain. The hero applied the crushed yarrow to the wound. He pressed it down. The bleeding began to slow. Not immediately. After a minute. Yarrow contained acolion, a substance that accelerates clotting. The hero didn't say a word. He simply demonstrated. Redbeard stood and watched as the blood stopped flowing. Then he looked at the hero. With the same long gaze as on the ship, he said something. The hero didn't understand the words, but the tone wasn't hostile, more puzzled. A slave who knows nautical commands, a slave who knows herbs, a strange slave. The hero stepped back, sat down on the ground. He lowered his eyes, as a troll should. He revealed exactly what was necessary. No more. Knowledge of a single herb. Any village woman could have known that. Nothing supernatural. But another small piece fell into place. Another small step from the ore towards something greater. After the incident with the yarrow a week, nothing has and everything has changed. Outwardly, the hero remained the same. Troll, those same rags, that same collar, that same bowl for porridge. But little things were different. The red-bearded no longer kicked him in mornings. I just called out to him, briefly, without malice. A bowl of porridge became a little bigger. On 2 sips, maybe 3. Small change, but in a world where calories is life, 2 sips of porridge that the difference between those to stand and the to fall. Large troll with scars survived. The wound healed. Not perfectly. Red scar from elbow to the wrist. But the arm was working. He could hold a hammer. He carry coal. He could live. His was Torgest, or that his was here. His real name is that life which he lived until slavery no one did cared. Torgest approached to the hero one in his house, silently. He sat down next to him. He put in front him a piece of flatbread, small, about 2 fingers, then stood up and left to his place. Not word, but the hero understood. That was duty. In world where you have anything a flatbread this whole fortune, and Torgest gave it. That is that the hero had saved his hand. The hero ate a flatbread, and remembered. First ally. By meant the language was come easier. The hero listened every day, every hour, every minute. Scandinavian language of the century was not that difficult as he feared. The grammar was easier modern Scandinavian languages, many common roots with English and German. His mind struggled to these roots and built bridges. Across 2 weeks on, he realized every third sentence, after every second. He didn't said. He was too the speaker that draws attention. A listening trell is invisible. He was listening and absorbed. Bjorn the helmsman sometimes muttered to himself, to his as, by the pier, depending the weather, about currents, about omens. Once he stopped next to the hero and looked at the sky. He uttered a long sentence. The hero realized almost everything. Bjorn was that the clouds are from the west, and what, in 2 days, they're a storm. The hero looked at the clouds. Bjorn was right. Feathery clouds in the west were replaced cumulus clouds, a classic sign of an approaching front. In 2 days, the A. The wind tore roofs. The rain poured down in sheets. The fjord was foaming. The hero lay in slave house and listened as water seeped through the cracks in walls. The roof was in 3 places. The trellises were getting wet. Everything was getting wet. But he lay and thought not about the rain. He was thinking about the priest. The priest did let him alone. Not physically. They did approach. He didn't. But the hero felt his gaze. Every day. The priest looked from the corner of the house, from the mast at the pier, from shadow of the smithy. He watched. Quietly and patiently, just a cat watches a mouse hole. The hero understood why. The priest was the only person in the settlement whose power was not based on strength or wealth. His power was based on knowledge, on the fact that he knew things others did not, about the gods, about signs, about fate. And now a troll had appeared who also knew things he shouldn't know. For the priest, this was a threat, not a military one, a spiritual one. If a slave knows what only the priest should know, then one of 2 things is true. Either the slave is sent by the gods, or the slave is dangerous. In either case, the priest wanted to know more. The hero decided to act first, not head-on, more subtly. He started small. Every morning on his way to work, he looked at the sky, for a long time, intently. then at the ground, at the dew, at the direction of the smoke from the chimneys. All of this was part of his habit of checking the weather. Simple meteorology. But from the outside, it looked like a ritual, as if the troll were reading the signs. He did it on purpose. Every morning, at the same time, he scanned the sky, then the ground, then the water of the fjord. He touched the wet grass. He sniffed the air. The priest noticed. The hero saw the priest stop and watch as he conducted his morning inspection. His curiosity grew. 4 days later, the priest approached. For the first time, he stopped 2 steps away from the hero. The hero stood on the shore and looked at the water. The priest spoke a phrase, slowly, as if speaking to a child, or to an animal. The hero understood. The priest asked what he saw. The hero answered, in 3 words, wind, change, tomorrow. He said the wind would change tomorrow. It wasn't magic, it was physics. The pressure was shifting. He could feel it in his ears. He could see it in the ripples on the water, in the behavior of the birds flying lower than usual. Tomorrow, the wind would be from the north. The priest looked at him for a long time. Then he left without a word. The next day the wind changed. It turned north, sharp and cold. The priest stood by the longhouse and looked at the cloth weather vane on the smithy's roof. The fabric flapped in the north wind. Then he looked toward the shore, toward where the hero was caulking yet another boat. Their eyes met for a second. The hero lowered his gaze. The hook had been cast. Now he had to wait. The priest had to come on his own. And he came. 3 days later. This time he brought a piece of smoked fish with him. He placed it on the ground next to the hero, just as one places bait in a trap. The hero didn't touch it. Not right away. He kept working. The priest stood and waited. Then he spoke, at length. The hero understood half of it. The priest spoke of the gods, about how Odin walks among people in the guise of a beggar, that knowledge is a gift from Odin, that the one who knows more than others is marked. The hero listened, and understood that the priest was trying to classify him, to fit him into his worldview. If a troll is marked by the gods, it strengthens the priest's position. The priest is the one who recognized the sign, who has seen the marked one. It was an interpretation that worked in the priest's favor. The hero did not argue. He took the fish, ate it, slowly. Then he looked at the priest and uttered a single sentence, a short one. He said that he hears things others do not hear, vaguely, ambiguously. It could be understood any way you wanted. The priest heard what he wanted to hear. His eyes lit up. He nodded. Then he left, quickly. He almost ran toward the Jarl's longhouse. The hero sat and chewed the fish. He had just made his second move in the game. The first was on the ship, the cry by the cliffs. The second was here, a connection with the priest, a dangerous connection. The priest could be a bridge to the Jarl, or a noose around his neck. If the priest decided the thrall was possessed by an evil spirit, the cure would be simple, a knife and a bonfire. But for now, the priest considered him marked by Odin. For now, it was to his advantage. For now. That evening in the slave quarters, Torgest sat down next to him, this time without a flatbread. He spoke, quietly. The hero didn't understand everything, but he understood the main point. Torgest was telling him about himself. He had been a slave for 5 years. He had been captured during a raid on the coast. He had been a fisherman, a free man. He had a wife. Had. Torgest didn't know what had become of her. 5 years. The hero listened, didn't interrupt, didn't offer comfort, just listened. Because in a world where you're nothing, sometimes the only thing you can give another person is your attention. Torgest finished speaking. He paused. Then he asked, How did the hero know about the herb? The hero answered briefly. His mother taught him. A lie, simple and unverifiable. Torghast nodded. He accepted it. A mother who knew herbs. That made sense. Normal, not suspicious. They fell silent. The wind howled outside the wall. A dog howled somewhere. The hero lay there and thought. 2 weeks in this world. He's alive. He's learning the language. He has one ally and one potential patron. A priest. A dangerous patron. Unreliable. But there were no other options. He also thought about the merchant with the rigged weights. That information lay in his head, waiting for its moment. Like a bullet in a magazine. One shot. It must not be wasted. He must wait for the moment when that shot hits the target precisely. And the target won't be the merchant. The target will be the Jarl. The Jarl must learn that he has been deceived, and he must learn it from the thrall. Then the thrall will become something more than just a paddle with a pulse. But not now. It's too soon. First, he needs to learn the language well enough to explain. First, the Jarl needs to get used to the idea that this thrall isn't quite ordinary. The priest will help with that, without even knowing it. Patience, the main weapon of the weak, the only weapon of a slave. Autumn came quickly. The days have shorter. The sun if appeared, it hung low above the horizon and disappeared early. The cold grew bitterer. Not winter yet, but already mean. In mornings the grass crunched with frost. The water in the fjord turned dark and heavy. The hero was working, every day. Boats he finished a long time ago. Now they were sent to various jobs. Carry stones for the wall around the pen, chop firewood, clean fish, unloading nets. He did everything, silently, with care. The body was getting used to it, slowly, painfully, but it was getting used to it. The muscles that were like ropes became firmer. Hands that were from the weight of the now, they lifted stones. Not big ones, but we lifted them. Food helped. The portions grew, not out of generosity, out of calculation. The red-bearded saw that this troll works better others. A working trell is worth more calories. Simple economics. The hero got porridge and sometimes a piece of fish. That was, but what to not die? The priest came every 3 or 4 days. They talked, in short phrases. The protagonist understood more. He spoke more confidently, but controlled every word. The priest questioned about dreams, about signs, about voices. The hero replied cautiously. He did lie about magical visions. He didn't have the prophet. He said about things that could be explained. About that birds fly lower before the rain. About that the water in the fjord becomes when the tide. That a certain color of sunset heralds wind. Everything this was science, observation, patterns. But the priest saw in this language of the gods, and the hero did deter him. Once, the priest asked a question that made the hero freeze. The priest asked where he had come from, not where he had been captured, where he had truly come from. There was something in the priest's voice, not suspicion, knowledge. The priest knew that the hero was no ordinary troll, not a peasant stolen from a village. Something else. The hero answered after a long pause. He said he had come from far away, from a place where people know many things, but have forgotten the most important one. Vague, beautiful, meaningless. But the priest heard what he wanted to hear. He nodded, as if it confirmed some theory of his. Then he left. The hero exhaled. The game with the priest was getting more and more dangerous. The priest was smart, not educated, but smart. He had the intuition of a predator. Sooner or later, he would ask a question to which there would be no good answer. It was necessary to speed up the main plan. 3 weeks after returning to the fjord, an opportunity arose. Another ship arrived at the settlement. Not a merchant ship, a warship, a drakkar from a neighboring fjord. On board was a jarl, another jarl. His name was Sigurd. He had sailed in with 20 warriors, not for war, for a conversation. The hero watched from the shore. The two jarls met at the pier. Their jarl. The hero had recently learned his name, Hakon. Jarl Hakon stood straight and calm. Jarl Sigurd was shorter but broader in the shoulders. His face was pockmarked. His eyes were fierce. They embraced, briefly, formally, not like friends, like equals who do not trust one another. In the evening, there was a feast in the longhouse. The hero did not see it. The thralls were not allowed in. But he heard it. Music, songs, shouts, the clinking of cups. The feast lasted until late into the night. In the morning, the thralls who worked in the longhouse were sent to clean up. The hero was not among them. But a female thrall told him in the evening. She spoke little, but what she said was important. The jarls were discussing a joint campaign, a major campaign, not a raid on a village, a real military campaign, to the south, to England, in the spring. The hero listened and felt his pulse quicken. A great campaign against England. If his calculations were correct, and it was around the 860s, this could be a great pagan army. An army that would change the history of England forever. And he was in one of the settlements that would take part. It was dangerous, and it was an opportunity. A huge opportunity. A great campaign meant great preparations. They needed ships, provisions, weapons, men, logistics. And logistics is mathematics. Mathematics is his domain. But first, he had to make his move with the merchant. The time had come. The next morning, Jarl Sigurd was still in the settlement. The hero saw his chance. Hakon and Sigurd were standing on the pier, talking. A priest stood nearby, and Bjorn the helmsman, and the Redbeard. The circle of power. Everyone who made the decisions. The hero approached the Redbeard. The man looked at him with irritation. The hero spoke quietly. 3 sentences. He said he had to tell Jarl Hakon something important. That the merchant who had come had cheated him. That the weights on the scales were wrong. The red-bearded man stared at him. Then he grabbed him by the collar and dragged him to the Jarl. Not gently. But not for punishment either. He led the slave to his master, the way one leads a dog that has found something in the bushes. Hakon turned. He saw the thrall. He frowned. Redbeard explained quickly. The thrall says the merchant cheated. Hakon looked at the hero. Gray eyes. Cold. Speak. The hero spoke, slowly, choosing his words. He explained about the scales, about the weight that was lighter than the others, about how the merchant put it on first, about how the Jarl had paid more silver than he should have, about 1/10 more. He didn't use words he couldn't explain, didn't mention physics or math. He said he'd seen the weight bounce differently, that his eyes were good at spotting small details, that he'd been watching the merchant's hands because he had nothing else to do. Hakon listened in silence. His face didn't change. No anger, no surprise. A stone. When the hero finished, Hakon was silent. Then he turned to Sigurd and asked if he knew this merchant. Sigurd laughed, briefly and bitterly. He said the merchant's name was Kettle, and that many knew him, and that many suspected, but no one could prove it. Hakon looked at the hero, for a long time. Then he uttered a phrase the hero would remember forever. The Jarl said that this thrall had better eyes than his advisors. It was said in front of everyone, in front of Sigurd, in front of Björn, in front of the priest, in front of the red-bearded man. The Jarl did not set him free. He did not reward him. He didn't praise him. He stated a fact. This slave has good eyes. But that was enough. The Jarl's words carried more weight than silver. The Jarl's words defined reality. If the Jarl said the thrall had good eyes, then a thrall with good eyes was more valuable than one without. The Redbeard led him back. He didn't strike him on the way. He led him to the slave house. He looked, and for the first time ever, he spoke the hero's name. Not a nickname, not a word meaning nobody, the name of the body's former owner. Einar. Redbeard said Einar, and after a pause added a word meaning big-eyed or sharp-eyed, a nickname. The hero nodded. Einar the Sharp-Eyed. The name wasn't his. The body wasn't his. But he had earned the nickname himself. It was the first thing that truly belonged to him. Not the yarrow picked from the ground. Not a piece of flatbread from Torgest, but a word spoken by the Jarl and heard by all. After the story with the merchant, Einar's Einar changed. Not abruptly, not like an explosion, like a tide, slowly and inevitable. They stopped send on black work. Not exactly. He's still carrying stones and chopped firewood, but now his was and to other tasks. When Björn was inspecting the ship before wintering, Redbeard brought Einar. Stop. Look. Björn didn't objected. He was didn't. Trell or a stone. He was his work. But Einar stood beside and watched, and saw how Björn checks each board, every joint, every fastener, how he sniffs the tree. If it smells sweet, it's rotting. If it rings when a blow a fist, it means it's sturdy. If a dull knocking, it means there's inside. Björn did this for years. His knowledge were at his in nose, in ears, and Einar stood beside and translated everything it into the world of logic, the word of wood, strength of joints, load of wood across the housing, engineering, primitive but functional. Once Björn found a crack in the keel, a long one, from the bow to the middle of the hull, shallow but dangerous. He crouched and stared at her, then swore. Repair the keel is almost building a ship. Einar was, and saw something else. A crack ran straight. It curved. It a knot in a tree. That meant that the tree cracked along the weak spot, along the fibers. But the knot held on. If reinforce the area around the knot and fill the crack, that keel will hold. Not forever, but for one season. Einar didn't say a word. He placed his place. But Björn noticed his glance. Noticed that the troll is looking not just what in these eyes is at work. Björn asked, briefly, "What do you see?" 2 words. The first words that Björn spoke to the troll. Einar replied, carefully. He pointed to the knot. He said the knot was strong, that the crack had bypassed it. That if they filled the crack with resin and laid an iron strip over it, the plank would hold out until spring. Björn looked at him, then at the crack, then back at him. He said nothing. But an hour later, Einar saw Björn heating the iron strip in the forge and placing it over the crack, over the knot, just as Einar had described. Björn didn't thank him, didn't nod, didn't look his way, but he did what the thrall had suggested. That was more than any thanks. It was an acknowledgement, quiet and invisible to everyone, but they both knew. Preparations for winter were in full swing. The settlement was bustling like an anthill. The women were salting fish and smoking meat. The men were repairing roofs and walls. They were herding livestock into covered stalls, chopping firewood, piles of firewood. Winter in Scandinavia is a war against the cold, and they prepared for it as if it were a real war. Einar worked and watched. He saw problems, many problems. Supplies were distributed unevenly. The Jarl and the Bonds had enough food. The Carls had barely enough. The thralls got the scraps. If the winter was long, someone would start starving by the end. And they would start starving from the bottom up, starting with the thralls. He thought about how to solve this problem. Not for everyone, for himself, for Torgest, for those who were close to him. A birch tree grew near the slave quarters, old, crooked. No one needed it. But Einar knew that birch bark was edible. The inner layer, a thin white film beneath the rough outer bark. It could be dried and ground into flour. Few calories. But when the porridge runs out, it's the difference between life and death. He began gathering the bark in the evenings, secretly, in small pieces so as not to damage the tree. He dried it in the slave quarters under straw. He ground it with stones. The result was coarse, bitter flour. He mixed it with water and formed it into lumps. Torgest watched this with skepticism. But he ate it, and he didn't die. So it worked. Einar also found wild garlic, growing on the slope above the settlement. Small bulbs the size of a fingernail. But they contained vitamin C. And vitamin C is protection against scurvy. Scurvy killed people in this world just as surely as swords. He gathered the garlic and hid it. He ate 1 bulb a day. Bitter, but necessary. One evening, the priest came again. This time he wasn't alone. A woman was with him. The Jarl's wife. Her name was Hilda. Tall, fair-haired, with a stern, beautiful face. She wore silver brooches on her shoulders and a bunch of keys on her belt. The keys signified power. The woman with the keys ruled the house, and the Jarl's house was a state in miniature. Hilda looked at Einar, without disgust, without pity, with curiosity, as one looks at an unusual animal. The priest said something to her. Einar caught the words. The priest was saying that the thrall predicted the weather, that the troll knew herbs, that the troll had keen eyes. Hilda asked Einar directly. Her voice was steady and commanding. She asked if he knew of any plants for a stomach ailment. Someone in the longhouse had a stomach ache. Maybe a child. Maybe Hilda herself, Einar thought. Quickly. Stomach pain could mean anything. An infection, poisoning, parasites. Without a diagnosis, he couldn't know. But he knew a universal remedy. Mint. Mint grew along the stream behind the settlement. He had seen it. Mint tea relieved cramps and aided digestion. It didn't cure the cause, but it eased the symptoms. Safe. No risk of harm. He said he knew the herb, that he would show where it grew, that the leaves needed to be steeped in hot water and drunk in small sips. Hilda nodded. She looked at the priest. The priest nodded too. They left. The next day, the red-bearded man led Einar to the stream. He untied his hands. For the first time ever, he untied his hands. Einar stood and looked at his free wrists. The skin beneath the ropes was red and chafed. He wiggled his fingers, clenched and unclenched his fists. A small movement. A huge sensation. The red-bearded man stood 3 paces away, with an axe at his belt, watching. But his hands were free. Einar found some mint, gathered a bunch, brought it to the Jarl's longhouse. For the first time in his life, he went inside. The house was enormous, 30 meters long, dark, smoky. A fire burned in a long hearth in the middle. Benches and couches stood along the sides, skins on the walls, weapons on hooks, the smell of smoke and roasted meat and sweat. Hilda was waiting. A boy of about 7 sat next to her on the bench, the Jarl's son. He was pale and clutching his stomach. Einar brewed the mint. He gave it to the boy. The boy drank in small sips. He grimaced at the taste, but he drank. An hour later, the boy felt better. The cramps had subsided. His face had turned pink. He fell asleep. Hilda looked at her sleeping son, then at Einar. And in her gaze, the hero saw something he hadn't seen in a single gaze since waking up in this world. Not gratitude. Something stronger. A debt. The woman who ran the Jarl's household owed him. A small debt, for the mint tea. But in a world where you have nothing, a small debt from a great man is a treasure. They led him out, tied him back up. His hands were in ropes again. The collar was in place. But something had shifted, tectonically. unnoticed by everyone except Einar. He lay on the straw in the slave house and smiled, for the first time since his death at the farmer's market. The smile was small and bitter, but it was there. Winter fell upon the fjord like a lid onto a coffin, quickly and heavy. The snow began in one day and didn't stop 3 days in a row. White was completely everything. Mountains, the shore, houses. The fjord hasn't frozen. Salt water held out. But by mornings on the stretched on of ice which the waves broke and carried away, the temperature was dropping. Einar didn't know exact figures. There did. But the body said that this was -10, maybe 15. The slave house was freezing right through. The walls made thin logs, and peat did retain the heat. The hearth inside did. The trellum fire was. They warmed their bodies, the 6 remaining. Einar, Torgest, the woman by named Astrid, the second boy who survived on ship, 2 captives from an English village. The old man died 3 days ago. Quiet, in my sleep, like Einar had expected. His body was carried out and left beyond the settlement. Bury in the ground we couldn't. They laid on stones and covered with stones. In the spring they will bury him, or they. Trello wasn't with full honors. The cold was the enemy, but Einar knew how with fight I defeat. Fight. He organized the trolls. Quiet. No orders. Showed. At night they slept together. Not apart on their places, but together. Close together. The body to body. Like beasts in a burrow. Each gave heat and received warmth. Astrid at first pulled away. Then she understood and moved closer back. Survival is more important disdain. Einar showed something. He typed some straw. A lot. He gathered from the stable when no one not. He stuffed with straw the cracks between the logs. A thick layer. Straw kept air. The air kept the heat. The simplest insulation. In slave house it a few degrees warmer. The difference between surviving and freezing to death. One of the Englishmen among the new captives had fallen ill. His name was something that sounded like Edmund. Einar wasn't sure. The language barrier. Edmund spoke Old English. Einar understood a few words. Old English and Old Norse had common roots, Germanic languages, like distant relatives. They could make themselves understood, with difficulty, through gestures and cognate words. Edmund was coughing. Not like that boy on the ship. No blood, a cold, or bronchitis. Einar brewed mint and added wild garlic. A bitter brew, but it contained phytoncides, antimicrobial substances, not antibiotics, but better than nothing. Edmund drank. He grimaced. He drank some more. A week later, the cough was gone. The second one cured. The second one in his debt. The winter days dragged on like tar. There was less work. They fed the livestock, cleared the snow, chopped firewood. But daylight was short. 4 hours, maybe 5. The rest of the time was darkness. Einar used the darkness. He thought. He planned. He organized. He knew there would be an expedition in the spring. A big expedition. And he knew he had to be on that ship. Not as a thrall at the oars. As someone useful. Someone whose place couldn't be taken by another slave. Navigation was the key. He knew more than any helmsman. But he couldn't show it outright. Too much knowledge at once and they'd declare him a sorcerer, or possessed, and they'd throw him into the bonfire. He had to feed the information drop by drop. The priest became the bridge, but the bridge needed to be strengthened. At the beginning of winter, Einar made his move, a risky one. He asked the priest for a meeting, through Torgest, who sometimes ran into the priest at the smithy. The priest came, in the evening, to the slave house. He wrinkled his nose at the smell, but came. Einar told him a story. Not his real one, another one. He said he'd had a dream, that in the dream he was standing on the shore of a large island, a green island to the west. that he saw rivers and hills and stone walls, that he saw people with crosses and gold, and that he saw ships sailing toward that shore. Many ships. The priest listened. His eyes shone in the darkness of the slave house. A large green island to the west, with rivers and hills and people with crosses. England. But Einar wasn't just describing England. He was describing a specific place. The mouth of the River Humber. The place where the great pagan army landed and began the conquest of Northumbria. He knew this from his textbooks. He knew the exact location. He knew which shore was suitable for landing. He knew where the fortifications were and where they were not. But he presented it as a dream, as a vision, as a message from the gods. The priest absorbed every word. The next day, Einar saw him at the Jarl's longhouse. The priest went in and out. Several times. He was bringing the story to the Jarl, rewriting it in his priestly language, adding signs and omens, turning the dream into a prophecy. Einar didn't know exactly what the priest was telling the Jarl, but 2 days later, something impossible happened. Redbeard came to the slave quarters. He untied Einar, removed the ropes from his hands, and led him to the longhouse, to Jarl Hakon. Hakon was sitting by the hearth. The priest stood nearby, and Bjorn, and 3 more warriors whom Einar recognized, the inner circle. Hakon looked at Einar for a long time. Then he spoke. He asked about the dream. Einar repeated what he had told the priest, word for word. He added details. The river is wide, the bank is gentle, suitable for ships. To the north of the mouth, steep cliffs. To the south, swamps. The best place to land was in the middle. There was a sandbar there. Ships could get close. Hakon listened. His face didn't change, but Einar could see what the Jarl was thinking. Calculating, weighing his options. Bjorn stood nearby and listened too. The helmsman knew the coast of England. He had been there. And he knew that the thrall's description was accurate. Frighteningly accurate. Bjorn looked at Hakon. He nodded. A single movement of the head. Confirmation. The place is real. The description is correct. Hakon leaned back. He looked at the fire. He thought. Then he turned to the priest and asked what it meant. The priest answered solemnly. He said that Odin had sent a sign through this troll, that the gods were pointing the way for the great campaign, that the shore from the vision was the place where victory and glory awaited them. Hakon was no fool. Einar could see that in his eyes. The Jarl did not blindly believe in visions. But the Jarl was a pragmatist. If the thrall knew of a coast that matched the real one, it didn't matter where that knowledge came from. What mattered was that it was useful. Hakon delivered his decision. 3 words. Einar didn't understand at first. Then he did, and his breath caught in his throat. The Jarl said that in the spring, Einar would go with them, on a ship, not in the oars, next to the helmsman. It wasn't an order of release. The collar remained. His status as a thrall remained. But his place on the ship was changing. Not a rowing bench. The stern. A place next to the one who steers the ship. Einar returned to the slave quarters. He sat down on the straw. His hands were shaking. Not from the cold. For the first time, not from the cold. Torgest looked at him, asked what was wrong. Einar said he would go on a campaign in the spring. Torgest was silent. Then he said that was good, or bad. It depended on whether he returned alive. Einar nodded. Torgest was right. The expedition could make him indispensable, or kill him. There was no third option. Outside the walls of the slave house, the wind howled. Snow drifted into the cracks that the straw hadn't covered. Winter was long. But spring was ahead, and in spring, everything would be decided. Winter would let go. It clung to the fjord like a dog to a paw, and wouldn't let go jaw. Snow lay up waist. The wind howled every night. Dinner was running out. Not that the Jarls, the ewe had enough, but for the Karlovs already considered every piece, and the trellis cut portions. A bowl of meds, half bowl, then a third. Einar felt as his body again began to devour itself. The muscles that he with such effort had over autumn were melting. Ribs became visible. Birch flower saved me. He chewed bitter lumps and forced my body to work. Torgest held on. He was large. The strength was greater. But even his face had grown gaunt. His protruded sharply. Her eyes were sunken. Astrid was silent. She hardly almost spoke. Einar, she her portion. Worked, slept, like a machine. Einar tried to get her to talk. No, out calculation. Astrid worked in Longhouse. Einar, she heard conversations. She saw things. Any information was valued. But Astrid remained silent. Something in her was broken. It had been a long time and deep. Einar didn't press the issue. The second boy from the ship had fallen ill. Not with a cold. Frostbite. The toes on his left foot had turned black. Einar saw it when the boy was taking off his bandages that evening. Black toes. Necrosis. In his world, that meant amputation. In this world, it meant death. Or amputation without anesthesia, which was almost the same thing, Einar thought. He had no instruments, no surgical knowledge. He was an office worker with a college degree and a subscription to scientific journals, not a doctor. But he knew the principle. Dead tissue had to be removed before the infection spread further. And he knew that in this world, a blacksmith did such things, with a red-hot knife. He went to the Redbeard, said the boy would lose his leg if his toes weren't cut off. The Redbeard looked at the boy, looked at the toes, shrugged. A troll without toes on his foot could still row. He could still carry things. He'd lose some value, but not function. The Redbeard took the boy to the blacksmith. Einar didn't go. He didn't want to see it. But he heard a scream. One, long, then silence. The boy returned in the evening, pale, with his leg bandaged, 3 toes. The blacksmith had cut off 3 toes and cauterized the wounds with a red-hot iron. Rough, effective. The boy would survive, if it didn't get infected. Einar washed the wound with garlic broth. Garlic contained allicin, a natural antibiotic. Weak, but better than nothing. He changed the bandage every day. Made from clean rags he washed in snowmelt. Cleanliness, the simplest principle of medicine, a principle this world had never known. The boy's name was Knut. He was 16. He had been captured a year ago, somewhere on the coast of Denmark. He was a fisherman's son, like Torgir. After the operation, Knut became a different person, quieter, more serious. And he began to listen to Einar. Not as a master, as an elder, a third ally. Einar counted his people. Torgeir, Knut, Edmund, the Englishman. 3. Astrid didn't count yet. She was nearby, but not with them. He had connections among the free people as well. The priest, slippery but useful. Björn, silent but respectful. Hilda, the Jarl's wife, indebted for mint tea. The red-bearded man, not an ally, but not an enemy either. He had grown accustomed to the idea that this thrall was no ordinary man. Jarl Hakon himself. He knew about him. He remembered. He expected him to be useful on the expedition. Not bad for a slave who, a month ago, could have been thrown overboard and no one would have noticed. But that wasn't enough. Not enough for what he was planning. The spring expedition was a test. If he proved himself on the expedition, his value would rise. If he failed, his value would drop to 0. And 0 value for a troll meant death. In the middle of winter, something happened that Einar hadn't planned on. At night, a priest came to the slave house, alone, without warning. He sat down across from Einar in the darkness. His eyes glinted in the moonlight seeping through the cracks. The priest spoke, quietly, quickly. Einar listened and felt himself growing cold inside. The priest said he knew, that he sensed, that Einar was not who he claimed to be, that no dreams could grant such knowledge, that he had been a priest for 30 years and knew what true visions looked like. And these were not them. Einar was silent. His heart was pounding in his throat. The priest continued. He said he didn't care where Einar got the knowledge he had. What mattered to him was something else. He said he was getting old, that his knees ached and his teeth were loose, that in 5 years, maybe 10, he would die, and that he needed a successor, someone to whom he could pass on his position with the Jarl. The priest was offering a deal. He would tell the Jarl that Einar's knowledge came from the gods. He would cover for him. He would help him rise. In return, Einar would become his apprentice, his man, his tool. When the priest died, Einar would take his place, and he would remember who had brought him there. Einar thought, quickly. The offer was generous. Too generous. The priest wasn't an altruist. He was an old man who sensed death approaching and wanted to leave a legacy. He didn't want his position with the Jarl to go to just anyone. He wanted to control the future even after death. But for Einar, it was a fast track, a direct path to the top. From thrall to advisor, through the priest. Risky. Being tied to the priest meant dependence. If the priest fell, Einar would fall with him. If the priest betrayed him, Einar would end up at the stake. But what were the alternatives? Rowing to death, hauling stones to death, waiting for a release that might never come. Einar answered. He said yes, but he added a condition. 1. He said that Torgest must get a better job. Not the smithy, something else. Something where he wouldn't be maimed again. The priest looked at him in surprise. A thrall bargaining for another thrall. Unusual. But the priest nodded, easily. To him, it was a trifle. To move one slave from one job to another. The priest's word carried enough weight with the Jarl for that. The deal was done. No handshakes. No oaths. Just 2 men in the darkness of the slave house agreeing on the future. One of them was a priest who was losing his power. The other a slave who was gaining it. The priest left. Einar lay on the straw and stared at the ceiling. He had just sold his freedom for the 2nd time. The first time, the universe had sold him into slavery. The 2nd time, he had sold himself to the priest. But there was a difference. The first time, he had no choice. The 2nd time, the choice was his. And that made all the difference in the world. Spring arrived like a promise. At first quietly, drops from roofs, dark patches on the slopes, streams swollen from meltwater. Then louder. The birds have returned. The grass pushed through the mud. The fjord cleared up. The water turned blue instead of black. And the settlement came to life. People came out from their dens like bears from their dens. They squinted at the sun. They stretched stiff from winter bodies. But their worth was short-lived, because that spring meant a hike, and a hike began right now. Einar watched the preparations. The Drakkar was pulled onto shore back last fall. Now they was being lowered back down. 30 men pushed the ship through the wet logs. The wood creaked. The hull crept toward the water slowly as a living creature that does once wake up. Einar saw that renovation Björn was holding up. The streak on keel hasn't budged. The crack remained silent. His advice worked. Björn did saw up. And although the helmsman didn't say a word, Einar caught his gaze. Brief. But in it was something new. Not respect. Not yet. Recognition, competence. For start is enough. Håkon announced a gathering. From the settlement went 25 warriors. This was not full lineup. Jarl Sigurd led his men from a neighboring fjord. 20. There were and other ships from other fjords. The war's gathering at the further along the coast. Einar knew that great pagan army numbered thousands warriors. Dozens ships. It was a speck in this avalanche, but a grain of sand with a map in my head. In the morning of departure, Einar stood on shore. The red-bearded man led him to the ship. For the first time, Einar was walking to the Drakar not as cargo, as a member crew, let in a collar, let with a rope in hands. But his place was not at oars. His place was at the stern, next to Björn. He stood up aboard board. Björn was standing at the helm. He looked at Einar. Nothing said. He nodded toward the next to him. Sit down. Einar sat down. The deck under him was the same. The boards, the smell, tar and salt. But the world has changed. He saw the sea from a different perspective. Not from the warriors, from the stern. From where the helmsman, wide and far. Hilda stood on shore. Nearby her son, he, very boy, to whom Einar brewed mint tea. The boy waved his hand. Hilda, no. She stood straight and motionless. She looked at the ship, at my husband, at the war that took him and could not return. Torgest remained in the settlement. The priest fulfilled his promise. Torgesta was moved from the forge to work from fishing nets. Easier, safer. Torgest didn't know why. Einar didn't say. No need. Knut stayed. He was limping. 3 toes on his 3 toes on foot. Rower from. It was bad. On the ship from trolls, there only Einar, the only slave among the free. The collar glistened in sun. Everyone saw it. No one didn't. Commented. The norm of the trell at the stern. Strange, but the Earl decided. They went out to the sea. The wind was favorable. The sails filled out. The ship flew. Björn steered confidently, south along the coast, toward the rendezvous point. Einar sat beside him and soaked it all in. He watched Björn read the sea. How he turned the wheel half a turn to the right when a wave hit the side. How he squinted into the sun to gauge the time. How he sniffed the wind. Björn was a master, but an intuitive master. He didn't know why he did what he did. He just did it. 30 years of experience had turned into instinct. Einar knew why. He could explain every one of Björn's movements with the laws of physics and hydrodynamics. But he didn't explain. He was learning something else. He was learning to do. Not to know, but to do. Because in this world, knowledge without skill is useless. On the second day of sailing, they reached the rendezvous point, a wide bay. And in this bay stood ships. Many ships. Einar counted. 10, 20, 30, 40. He stopped counting at 50. Drakars and Norse, warships and transport ships, sails of different colors, red, white, striped, carved heads on the bows. Animal snouts glared at each other across the water. An army. A real army. Einar looked at it and felt something cold crawl down his spine. He knew what this army would do. He knew from the textbooks. It would cross the sea and descend upon England. It would destroy kingdoms, kill thousands, change the island's history forever. And he was a part of it. A slave in a collar on the stern of one of the 50 ships. An accomplice. He couldn't stop it, even if he wanted to. One man doesn't stop an avalanche. One man tries to survive while the avalanche passes. Hakon went ashore. He met with the other jarls. There were many of them. Einar saw them from the ship as they stood on the shore. A group of men in furs and chainmail, leaders of the pack. They were talking, waving their arms, pointing at a map. They had a map, a rough one, drawn on leather, but a map. Einar wanted to see it, wanted it so badly his fingers itched. But he wasn't called ashore. He was a thrall. Thralls aren't invited to war councils. That evening, Hakon returned to the ship. He was gloomy. Something had gone wrong at the council. Einar could see it in his face. in the way the Jarl sat at the rail and stared out at the water for a long time. The priest approached the Jarl. They spoke quietly. Einar sat 5 meters away and heard every word. The dispute was over the route. Some of the Jarls wanted to go south, to the coast of Wessex. There are rich monasteries there, easy pickings. Others wanted to go north, to Northumbria. There is a weak king and a civil war. Northumbria is divided. 2 pretenders to the throne were fighting each other, the perfect moment for an invasion. Hakon wanted to go north, because the priest had told him about Einar's vision, about the shore, about the river mouth. But the other Jarls hadn't heard of this vision, and they didn't trust the priest of a foreign Jarl. Everyone trusted their own priest, and every priest was pulling in his own direction. Einar listened and thought. He knew how this dispute would end. The army would march north. That's how it had always been in history. They would land in East Anglia. Then they would advance on Northumbria. They would take York. It would happen. The question was whether it would happen with Hakon's help or without him. If Hakon turned out to be right and the army marched north, his authority would grow, and Einar's authority along with it. If Hakon found himself in the minority and the army marched south, Einar would lose everything he had built. He had to act. That night, Einar asked Bjorn to tell the Jarl that he had something to say. Bjorn looked at him for a long time. Then he went to the Jarl. An hour later, Hakon came to the stern, alone, at night, to a slave. It was unheard of. But Hakon was a pragmatist. If a slave has information, the Jarl will come to the slave. Einar spoke quickly and precisely. He said that Northumbria was weak right now. 2 kings were at war with each other. The armies were exhausted. York's walls were old, Roman, partially destroyed. The northern wall was the weakest. Stones had crumbled there, and no one had repaired them. If they strike quickly and precisely, the city will fall before the 2 kings unite. Håkon listened. His eyes in the moonlight were like 2 pieces of ice. He asked how Einar knew about the 2 kings. Einar was ready. He said he'd heard it from merchants who'd come to his former master. What the merchants had said about the war in Northumbria, what he had remembered, a half-truth. The merchants might indeed have known about the political situation in England. News traveled slowly, but it traveled. Håkon did not bother to check. He was thinking of something else, of the walls of York, of the northern wall, of the possibility of striking quickly. The Jarl stood up. He looked down at Einar, and for the first time ever, Einar saw in his gaze not indifference, not curiosity, interest. Genuine, cold, calculating interest, like that of a man who had found a good tool. Håkon left. The next day the Council of Jarls continued. Einar did not know what Håkon had said, but that evening Håkon returned a different man, calm, confident. The decision had been made. The army was marching north, to Northumbria, through East Anglia, just like in the textbooks, just like in history. Einar sat at the stern and looked out at the 50 ships in the bay, an army that would change the world, and he had just helped it choose its direction. Thrall, in his collar, had nudged history along. He hadn't changed it. He'd nudged it in the direction it was already heading. But now Håkon was on the right side of that decision, and Einar was the reason. The army set into the ad at 50 or more ships stretched in line. The sails filled the horizon. It was a breathtaking sight. Einar sat at the stern and watched. He saw the drakars to the left and right. He saw the oars rise and fall in unison, the foam crashing against the sides, the seagulls circling above the masts. Beautiful. If you forget why these ships are sailing. The crossing of the North Sea took 4 days. The wind changed twice. The first time on the second day. A headwind from the west. The sails flapped. The ships slowed down. The rowers leaned into their oars. Bjorn cursed under his breath and held the course. Einar was silent. But when Bjorn turned away for a second, he looked up at the sky. The clouds were moving in layers, the lower ones to the west, the upper ones to the east. A shift in the wind. In a few hours, the wind would turn favorable. He knew it. Meteorology. Bjorn didn't know. Bjorn was preparing to row until evening. Einar made up his mind. Quietly, almost in a whisper. He told Bjorn that the wind would change soon, that they needed to wait. Bjorn looked at him, harshly. The helmsman didn't like being told what to do, especially by a thrall. Einar pointed at the clouds, at the upper layer. He said one word. Soon. Bjorn looked up. He saw the clouds, but he didn't read them the way Einar did. To Bjorn, clouds were just clouds. To Einar, they were data. Bjorn said nothing, but he didn't give the order to row. He waited. 2 hours later, the wind shifted. It became a tailwind, a strong one. The sails billowed. The ships surged forward. Bjorn stood at the helm and looked out at the sea. Then he glanced at Einar, just for a moment. But Einar saw it. There was something new in the helmsman's eyes. Respect. Not for a person, for knowledge. Bjorn respected the sea and everything that helped him understand it. If a thrall understood the clouds, then a thrall deserved a modicum of respect. No more, but a modicum. The wind changed a second time on the fourth day. Abruptly. A storm. The sky turned black within an hour. The waves rose to the height of the mast. Rain poured horizontally. The army scattered. Every ship fought for itself. Hakon's Drakkar plunged into the waves like a splinter. Water flooded the deck. The warriors bailed it out with buckets. Bjorn stood at the helm. He clung to the tiller with both hands. The veins in his neck bulged like ropes. He held his course, or tried to. In a storm, there is no course. There is only struggle. Einar was bailing water too. The collar pressed against his throat with every tilt. His hands burned. His back ached. But he worked. Not because he wanted to, because if he didn't bail the water, everyone would drown. Both the thrall and the jarl. The sea makes no distinctions. The storm lasted 6 hours. By nightfall, the wind had died down. The waves had subsided. The sky had cleared. The stars spilled out like scattered pearls on black velvet. Einar lay on the wet deck and breathed. His whole body was one great ache. But he was alive. The ship was intact. Bjorn stood at the helm and looked at the stars. He was determining their position. Einar looked too. The North Star. The angle. They had drifted south. Far south. The storm had carried them 30 miles south of their course. Bjorn realized this too. He corrected the course. North. At dawn they saw land. The coast. Low and flat. Sand dunes. Marshes. East Anglia. They had arrived. Not where they had planned. The storm had blown them south. But this was England. The army was gathering anew. Ships were arriving one after another. Some were damaged. One had a broken mast. Another had lost its rudder. A third was missing. Maybe it had sunk. Maybe it had been swept away. No one knew. By noon, 47 ships out of more than 50 were anchored in the bay. 3 losses. Not many for a storm. But there were people on every lost ship. 30 to 40 people. Over 100 lives. The sea had taken its toll. The jarls had gathered again on the shore. Einar could see them from the ship. They were arguing, gesturing. Some were pointing south. They wanted to plunder here. Eastern England lay defenseless before them. Why go further north when the spoils were right here? Hakon stood and said nothing. Then he turned toward the ship, toward the stern. He looked at Einar, a long look. Then he turned away and spoke to the other jarls. Einar didn't hear the words, but he saw the reaction. The jarls were listening to Hakon. Some nodded. Hakon was using the information Einar had given him, about the 2 kings of Northumbria, about York's weak walls, about the possibility of taking the city quickly. Einar didn't know the exact arguments. But the result was clear. By evening, the decision had been made. The army would not remain in East Anglia. It would spend the winter here, but march on Northumbria in the spring. That is exactly how it happened in history. The great pagan army landed in East Anglia in 865. It spent the winter there. In the spring of 866, it marched north and took York. Einar wasn't changing history. He was nudging it along the tracks that already existed. But now Hakon was the voice of this course, and every jarl in the bay knew that Hakon spoke the truth. That night, Einar sat at the stern and did the math. The year 865. Now he knew for sure. Give or take a year. He knew what would happen next. He knew decades into the future. York would fall. Northumbria would collapse. Then Mercia. Then East Anglia again. Only Wessex would hold out. Alfred the Great. The only Anglo-Saxon king who would be called the Great. He would stop the Vikings. But that would be years from now. For now, time was on the Northmen's side. For now, they were winning. And Einar was riding the crest of that wave. Small, insignificant, but knowing where the wave was taking him. Winter quarters in East England was a strange time. They headed not at war. It stood camped and waited for spring. The local king bought his way out. He gave horses and provisions in exchange for peace. 1,000 with the warriors took up on the plain by the river. Tents and dugouts stretched for half a mile. Bonfires burned during the day and at night. Smoke rose in columns. From afar, the camp resembled a city. Dirty, noisy, temporary city. Einar lived by Hakon's Hakona. His position was unusual. Formally slave, on the collar. But he walked freely. The ropes in his were... He ate together with the soldiers. He once at table, side by side. Their same food, at that same amount. Meat, bread, fish, beer. The body responded. After a month, he gained weight. His muscles became firmer. He's no longer be a skull. He looked like a human being, not like a skeleton in rags. Bjorn started talking to him, not as an equal, as an assistant. He asked about the weather, about the wind, about omens. Einar answered, dosing out his answers carefully, giving 10% more than Bjorn could have figured out on his own. Not 50, not 50, not 100. Just 10. Exactly enough to be useful and not become intimidating. Bjorn accepted this in silence. He didn't ask where it came from. The helmsman was a man of action. If the advice works, it doesn't matter where it came from. The priest was nearby too. He walked around the camp and talked to the other priests, building connections. He was strengthening his position. Exclusive videos, story continuations, and bonus content are already available on Patreon before YouTube, so check the link in the description for early access to all new recaps and continuations.